welcome students to the overview for Evolution Part 1, done by your wonderful Mr. Proud. Okay, I hope that this can guide you in your learning for the entire topic. So we start off this overview firstly by talking about variation. We've heard about variation, and variation really happens within and between species. Okay. Apart from variation, another big idea that we've seen before is that of mutation. Now, mutation, it really can be defined as small changes that happen in individual characteristics. It doesn't have to be bad or it doesn't have to be good, okay? It just happens in individual characteristics. So we go back to variation, and it is brought about by, yes, it is brought about by natural selection. So what is natural selection? And we'll be talking a lot about it throughout this entire topic. Okay, Darwin, he was the first one to theorize that the fittest amongst all organisms survive. So he termed this as natural selection, or otherwise known as survival of the fittest. And if we move on to talking about mutation, we've seen another key idea, that of genetic variation. On the other side, we just finished in this topic, and that is on Mendelian inheritance. So how are these two ideas linked, and how are all of it tied together? Okay, so genetic variation, it comes down to the idea of continuous variation that comes from the combination of individual genes. All right? In Mendelian inheritance, we realize that there are two copies of each allele and one comes from each parent. So everything, all your traits, everything that is inherited comes from these alleles. And it is together that these three key ideas of natural selection, genetic variation, and Mendelian inheritance that you then start to have your modern understanding of evolution. Okay? This is what is otherwise known as Neo-Darwinism, and this is actually how we tie everything that we've learned and how we are going to be learning more about evolution. So it is from this modern understanding of evolution that we get the idea of descent with modification. So let's try and unpack this phrase first. On one side, we have the idea of descent. What is descent? Simply put, it is the passing on of heritable genetic changes. Okay, heritable genetic changes is the key idea onto the next generation. And these are linked to your Mendelian inheritance and genetic variation. Key ideas. Yeah. Okay, so then what about modification? Well, modification is really talking about where evolution can only occur when there are changes in allele frequencies within a population over time. Okay. So key idea being allele frequencies. So evolution only occurs when there are changes in allele frequency within a population over time. Now this change in allele frequency can occur over much time, and evolution in that sense can occur at very, very different time scales. Okay, so in that sense, we are talking about a small scale and a large scale. On the small scale, we have something called microevolution. Okay, so evolution occurring on a small scale. Okay, so microevolution occurring on a small scale. So what is a small scale? A small scale can really encompass a few generations, just a change in a few generations. It happens often within a single population. Okay, from a few generations, there are a few changes in the allele frequency. One example can be that of the changing frequency of alleles for dark wings in beetles from one generation to the next, depending on how the environment changes. Now, there are many more examples that you can actually go and read up about, and really, it is all talking about evolution happening within a single population. And with microevolution, we know that there will be no new species being formed. There are changes in allele frequencies, but it is not enough to say that new species are being formed. Now, if we go on to the large scale, okay, we can talk about macroevolution. Macroevolution occurs on a large scale. What is a large scale? Okay, is when there are thousands or maybe even more than millions of generations occurring over a long time span. Okay, so we say that this happens on a scale that transcends boundaries of the single species. Okay, it transcends beyond just switching from one species to another, creating a new species. It transcends that, it makes many different species. Okay, so an example is the evolution and radiation of dinosaur lineages. You know that there are many dinosaur lineages over so many generations. Okay, or another more relatable example can be that of mammals and birds diverging from reptiles. Okay, so many species formed and it transcended the boundaries of single species. So together, all this makes it apparent that new species will be formed through macroevolution. Okay, so with that, we're actually done talking about evolution and the time scale. Now back to allele frequency. What is allele frequency? How does it change? And what can it lead to? Okay, so actually this whole topic really boils down to the idea and getting familiar with allele frequency and how it might change and how it can be affected. So what is allele frequency? Well, to simply say, it is the relative frequency of an allele appearing in a population. Imagine taking a large sample of organisms from a population and you could somehow count the alleles for a certain trait. Okay, and from there is how we can then say that evolution is a measure of changes in the allele frequencies in a population over successive generations. So if you could sample it over many generations, okay, in the same population for the same trait, you are looking at how the allele frequencies change. Okay. So certain new terms or certain few terms that you really should be comfortable with is one, that of population. What is population? Well, population is a group of interbreeding individuals belonging to a species. They need to be able to breed amongst themselves. Okay, so they are a group of interbreeding individuals belonging to a species. Now, then, what is a species? What constitutes a species? Okay, species, broadly defined, okay, it is known as a group of organisms capable of interbreeding, and producing fertile, viable offspring. And they themselves must be reproductively isolated from another closely related or maybe not so closely related species. So they can interbreed and they produce fertile and viable offspring amongst themselves. Okay, so that is what we define a species as. So now that you understand a bit about allele frequencies, you should also take note that changes in allele frequency over time is what leads to evolution. But evolution is a broad term. So we say that changes in allele frequency over time leads to speciation. Speciation amongst a species, okay, they start splitting up. So now we go back to the idea of allele frequencies and we would like to see really what are the key drivers of allele frequency. So you say that changes in allele frequencies can be brought about by 5 major drivers. Okay, there are 5 major drivers that we're going to learn about. The first of which is probably the biggest factor, and that of natural selection. So let's break down this term of natural selection. What does it really mean? Okay. Now, when it comes to natural selection, we are talking about the fact that individuals with certain inherited traits tend to survive and reproduce at higher rates than other individuals. So we say that it is because of these traits that these individuals have better or higher reproductive success. Okay. Now, with natural selection, there are three types. Okay, three types of selection. There can be directional selection, and it is where the phenotype at one extreme keeps on being repeatedly selected for. Okay, so what initially were maybe relatively rare individuals keeps on getting selected, and over time, this gets represented as having more individuals. Okay, so it starts off being rare and becomes much more over time because they are repeatedly selected for. Another type of selection is that of disruptive selection. In disruptive selection, intermediate phenotypes are selected against, so it favors individuals on both extremes. And finally, the third type of selection is that of stabilizing selection. This is when extreme phenotypes are selected against, and as a result, your more common intermediate variants are favored. Okay? At this juncture, it might be good for you to pause the video and see if you need to catch up. If not, let's continue. So with natural selection, it is important to break it down and see how it can actually contribute to evolution. What are the ideas behind natural selection? Okay, so the first one is that of variation. And in variation, I've talked about this, it is when organisms within populations exhibit individual variation in appearance and behavior. Okay, and the difference is often due to presence of different alleles. So the individuals have different alleles amongst them. Now, why would individuals actually have different alleles? Think about it for a while. Got the answer? Yes, meiosis and sexual reproduction, or random fusion in sexual reproduction, are a significant source of variation. And we have seen these ideas pop up again and again and how they contribute to variation. So the next key driver of natural selection is that of inheritance. Okay? With inheritance, one key idea is that of selective advantage. With selective advantage, you have the key idea of having survival of the fittest. Now, due to variation during certain environmental changes, it will allow certain individuals to survive and reproduce way more successfully. Now, because these environmental changes cause certain individuals to survive and certain individuals to die out, we term these environmental changes as selection pressures. Okay. Also, with inheritance, like always produces like. In other words, some advantageous traits are more likely to be passed down from parent to offspring. Okay. So these advantageous traits will lead to evolution taking place if these traits are heritable. Now, the third and probably the most important factor for natural selection is that of population growth. And there are three key ideas that govern population growth. The first is that all organisms have an overproduction of offspring. Secondly, that they all struggle for survival. The offspring struggle for survival. And third is that overall, eventually there's a constancy of numbers. Now, how do we get here? It is because most populations have more offspring than local resources can actually support. Okay, what do we mean by resources? Like food, shelter, stuff like that. So this leads to a struggle for your resources, and as a result, each generation experiences substantial mortality. With that, we're done talking about natural selection, and this would be a good juncture for you to take a pause and try to catch up. Let's look at the second biggest driver for changes in allele frequency, which is disruption of gene flow. Now, what is gene flow? Okay, in natural conditions, gene flow is the transfer of alleles from one population to another. In natural states, it happens like that. So, with the gene flow, this will reduce differences in allele frequencies between populations. Remember, all this is in natural state. So, what does disruption do? Well, disruption results in differences in allele frequencies. It's like as if there's a cut in the flow. So if there's disruption of gene flow, there won't be any transfer of alleles from one population to another. Now, the third driver of changes to allele frequency is that of genetic drift. What is genetic drift? It is the change in allele frequencies due to a chance event. Okay, so a chance event happening to the population. Now, why do we call it a chance event? It is because the chance with which allele ends up being lost. Maybe you have two different alleles, which allele being lost is indiscriminate. Okay, there's a random chance. And because of that, you will reduce genetic variation in the population. Now, one form of genetic drift is that of founder effect. What is founder effect? Well, it's when a few members of an original population become pioneers and they start a new isolated population. Okay, maybe they drift out or due to some chance event, they start a new isolated population. So this may result in, firstly, this new population having reduced genetic variation from the original population because only a few pioneers came up, right? Or it could also result in having non-random sample of genes from the original population. And as you can see from the picture I've inserted here, the butterflies that have formed that new isolated population, not only do they have reduced genetic variation, but there's also a non-random sampling of genes. What do I mean? It's because in this new isolated population, you can see that there's one orange and two brown, as opposed to the original population having white, orange, and brown butterflies. Okay, so that is the founder effect. Now, another form of genetic drift is that of the bottleneck effect. What is the bottleneck effect? Well, it is when there is a often catastrophic event that leads to a drastic reduction in the population. So within a population, sometimes a catastrophic event can occur, and this leads to a drastic reduction in the population. In this case, a few random surviving individuals may lead to certain alleles being overrepresented or underrepresented in subsequent generations. Now, when we talk about catastrophic, it doesn't necessarily have to be something as major like an earthquake or whatever. It can be something as simple as a wipeout. Okay. For example, let's say we have a population of beetles, varying color of beetles, right? And someone happens to wipe out a good number of them, and we're left off with one green and a few brown ones. Okay, so eventually, as the generations then try to recover from this catastrophic event, yeah, they the alleles will be either overrepresented. Which one will be overrepresented? The brown ones will be overrepresented, and the green ones probably will become underrepresented. And over time, this will get accentuated. Okay, so that in essence is the bottleneck effect. Now, over the course of evolutionary history, there have been many catastrophic events, none more famous than the extinction of dinosaurs. Okay, so this, you could also argue that there were many bottleneck effects to many dinosaur populations and reptile populations, and this is how then we started getting the more modern reptiles and the more modern small mammals. Okay, get back and see what is the fourth driver for changes to allele frequency. Okay, that is of non-random mating, and it is in the name itself. Okay, it's pretty self-explanatory. It is when there is preferential choosing of mates. Okay, random mixing does not occur. Now, the most common example for this is seen in peacocks, where the female, the peahen, chooses actually males with the bigger, brighter plumages. Now, does it only happen in animals? Well, I'll leave you to be the judge of that because, well, if you ask some people, there's actually non random mating even in humans, right? Okay, anyway. Now, there's another driver that changes allele frequencies, not just in terms of the existing alleles, but rather there's another factor that introduces a new source of alleles. Can you guess what that is? Yes, that is mutation. Now, we've talked about mutations countless number of times, okay? And simply put, it's the random change in an organism's DNA. Now, although mutations at a particular gene locus are oftentimes rare, we then actually say that it is rather the cumulative impact of mutations at all loci over long periods of time can end up becoming very, very significant to the organism. All right. So mutations can introduce alleles, and over time, this can become very significant. Then we also say that once a mutation generates a new allele, there will be evolutionary forces like natural selection that can then take over. Okay, then we tie it back to natural selection where there's variation, there's inheritance, survival of the fittest, where selective advantage comes into play. Yeah, all that can actually take over and change the allele frequency and drive evolution forwards. Okay, so once a mutation generates a new allele, evolutionary forces like natural selection can take over and change the allele frequency. Now we're actually done talking about what drives changes in allele frequencies. But now let's go back and look at what ends up becoming the product of these changes in allele frequencies, and that is speciation. So we define speciation as when there is one or more new species arising from a previously existing species. Okay, so speciation is when there is one or more new species arising from a previously existing species, and this is brought about by change in allele frequencies over time. So speciation can actually be due to two modes of speciation. So one mode of speciation is also known as allopatric speciation. Another maybe more common term for allopatric speciation is that of geographic speciation, where it involves geographical isolation due to a physical barrier. So one thing that actually helps me remember what allopatric speciation is the Alps. Alps, A-L, Alps, right? So the mountain. It helps me remember that there is a geographical isolation like a mountain, a physical barrier. Then another mode of speciation is that of sympatric speciation. What is sympatric speciation? Okay, in this case, it's not geographically isolated, but there are certain reproductive barriers. Now, how I like to remember this is something like sympatric, same, right? Sounds the same. They are like same, but then slowly they start becoming different. So sympatric, same, yeah. Now, one form of reproductive barrier that can lead to sympatric speciation is that of physiological isolation, where there is different internal functions in organisms, and because of that, they can no longer reproduce. Then another form of reproductive barrier that can lead to sympatric speciation is that of behavioral isolation. This is when there are unique, maybe mating rituals or preferences between certain organisms. So they prefer certain mates versus not preferring some other mates. Okay. Now, at the end of the day, be it allopatric speciation or sympatric speciation, we say that over time, there is reproductive isolation in either case, allopatric or sympatric speciation, and it actually stops members of each subpopulation from being able to interbreed to form fertile, viable offspring. And therefore, remember the phrase fertile, viable offspring? Yeah, if they cannot interbreed to form fertile viable offspring, they are no longer the same species. Okay, and with that, I'm done with Evo 1. I hope this overview has been useful and maybe a bit different rather than just doing it in class. Okay, so I hope you managed to view this before we next meet in class, and when we do meet in the tutorial, I would like to hear some of your questions. Okay, so it's been my pleasure. Thank you very much, and see you soon.